Dr. Fraad will present her ideas to us, and then we will have a question and answer session. And for participation, we ask that people use the chat function to simply get on what we call the stack. The stack is the sequence of people who want to be able to ask a question or make a comment. So by going to chat and putting in your name, you will be put on the list for being called on. And you can also use that raise your hand function. And the team this morning that's working with this is Virginia Hammond is going to be keeping track of the chat and the raise hands function, so everybody has a chance to participate. Our tech advisor is Ryan Enger. And then the fourth party is Joe Polito, who will be handling the study stack. And the study stack, as many of you already know.
Oh my.
Well, it appears as though we have lost John Howell.
Yes, it does.
I wonder where he went.
Plug.
Okay, well, the show must go on.
Maybe he'll be back.
Yes, I am sure he will be back. I think he was just wrapping up here we go. He's coming in.
Good.
Maybe. I just let him in, but now I've lost him. Where'd he go?
He's here. He's just not. John, you're muted and your video's off. Well, Suzanne Howell is here, but.
There we go.
Oh, there you are. Good.
I don't know, maybe I hit the wrong button, or maybe something else happened out of the mysterious blue, but I'm glad to be back. And so we can get on with the topic at hand. So it's my delight to introduce Dr. Fraad. I've never had the privilege of meeting her in person, but I've listened to some of her presentations, and I'm really excited to have her here to join us today. So, as you may have read on the announcement, that Dr. Fraad is a licensed mental health counselor and hypnotherapist in private practice in New York City, and she's been in practice for 46 years. Doctorate degree from Columbia University's Teachers College, and has done postdoctoral work at Yale University Medical School's Child Studies Center. And what Dr. Fraad does is she writes and speaks on the intersection of politics, economics, and personal life. She's a founding member of the feminist movement and the journal Rethinking Marxism. And for 40 years, she's been committed to transforming U.S. personal and political life. She specializes in topics in which psychology and economics overlap. And these topics, of course, remain loaded with taboos, confusions, ignorance, and fear, preventing us sometimes from asking the big questions and daring us to discuss big answers. Well, we in monetary reform think we do dare to ask big questions, and we're happy to have Dr. Fraad here to help us along with that. And I think, you know, in monetary reform is sometimes viewed as sort of a distant and abstract problem and difficult for people to link onto. Well, what I'm looking forward to from Dr. Fraad is helping us make that link to how it impacts people, and I think we will be in for a treat with regard to that. And I will also suggest to you her presentations that are on the web. There's a wonderful one that she and Dr. Wolf, her husband, did at the University of Southern Maine. It's called, with a delicate title, Capitalism Hits the Fan. And you can find that on YouTube. It's very impressive. And then she also has a podcast called Capitalism Hits Home. So at any rate, I don't, Dr. Fraad's title today is Patriarchy and Capitalism in the cases of Cuomo, Weinstein, Cosby, Epstein, and R. Kelly. Now, it's not clear to me what the link is to the money system, but I think we're in for an interesting adventure this morning. And I think we will be offered some insights that will give a bigger context to what we do in monetary reform and may be of great help to us in our work. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Fraad. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I just want to make one little addition that I also have a podcast with Max Golding called It's Not Just in Your Head. And that's addressed to people who are in the therapy community in some way, because the therapy community is particularly backward in thinking that people's problems are in their heads. Obviously, if you're evicted, it's not in your head. And we feel that people are impacted by the monetary system, by economics, by politics, by the culture they live in, by their gender, by their race, and not just their parents' treatment of them as children or what's in their psychological makeup, which itself is shaped by mutually shaping influences from the outside as well as from personal life. And so it creates a context. In any rate, what I want to do is talk about patriarchy and capitalism in the case of 4 or 5 men who became famous for mass molestations of women, and also corruption and lying and the things that usually go along with sexual bullying. And they are Andrew Cuomo. I'll say their names first and say a little bit about who they are for people who don't know. And they're Andrew Cuomo, they're Epstein, they're Cosby, they're R. Kelly, and they're Bill Cosby. They're men of different ages, of different races, of different ethnicities, but what they have in common is using their power and their money and their chance at career advancement to molest multiple women. The Me Too movement has brought this phenomenon to the public, and these men have been jailed for their mass mobilization, their mass molestation, even though it was ignored for many, many years in all cases. Just because people are here from elsewhere, I'll say a few words about who they were, what their position was. And we'll start with Andrew Cuomo. He was the governor of New York for many, many years. He was a notorious bully and he just resigned because of the pressure of 11 women who complained of his sexual coercion of them in his office. He was a powerful governor. He managed to put through right-wing legislation while posing as a liberal because he had 6 Democratic state senators who actually voted with the Republicans and were right-wing. So he could present liberal legislation and pretend to be progressive while making sure that these men, all men, cooperated with them. Not that all men have any particular idea, but these were all men. At any rate, since 5 out of the 6 were defeated by Democratic Socialists in New York, he no longer had that coalition. He also was heavily funded by the real estate lobby, which in New York City is a hugely powerful lobby, as well as multiple corporations, including the biggest nursing home corporation in the United States, in New York City, and perhaps in the United States. And he did them the little favor of hiding from the public the statistics of the huge number of nursing home residents who were allowed to die of COVID. So he's also implicated in fraud, although that wasn't at the forefront of his recent resignation. I should also mention that he resigned because he acted noble and said he didn't want to sully the office of governor. But he also resigned because impeachment processes were in place. And if you're impeached, you can't run again. He had already collected $18 million for his next election. And he hopes to use that money to manipulate public opinion and be able to run again, which he couldn't if he were formally impeached. That's what his friend Carl Heastie at the legislature said in New York. However, that's not true. He can still be impeached, and there are still movements to impeach him. So he was a notorious bully, fraud committer. He got $5 million to write a description of how well he handled COVID in New York City, and he had his staff paid by the city working on it, which is also fraud. He's not in jail. He is just out of office, and we hope will soon be impeached. Bill Cosby was a famous comedian. Probably he had the most successful show in the United States about this wonderful Black family man. And he is on record for abusing at least 80 women, many of whom testified that he became an avuncular, an uncle-like warm presence in their lives as they began their careers in entertainment, looking to be a mentor because he was very powerful and very rich and had the most popular show on television. He then invited them for coffee, drugged them, and sexually molested them when they were in a drugged state. He recently got out of jail because he had confessed to drugging and molesting women to a district attorney who promised he would not prosecute him. However, a new case of a 15-year-old girl who wasn't part of that has emerged, and he may return to jail. The next one I'll talk about, and if everybody knows all these, just tell me, okay, we all know. Do you all know about it? I mean, I don't know if these are international or national cases. Can you tell me?
Well, I think a lot of people have heard about certainly the Cuomo case and the Cosby case and the Weinstein case. I'm not so sure about the other two.
Okay, well, R. Kelly was a famous Black rap singer, very successful, who on the basis of his success and his introduction of young teens as young as 12 and up to about 20, on the basis of his introducing them to fame and possibility, sexually molested them and kept them prisoner. He married one of them because he was in danger of being in trouble. He married her when she was 15. That's against the law, but they lied. And because he made a lot of money for his record company and for himself, he was able to get away with this for about 10 years. Because molestation is interracial. In this case, it's all males, but it's interracial and intercultural, and all ethnicities are guilty. In any case, Jeffrey Epstein, who people may not also know, molested hundreds of girls. He was immensely wealthy. He had a deal with the American CIA because he gave the tapes of famous rich men raping children, basically teenagers and young teens, and kept them for the CIA. So he got away with it for a long time. At an earlier date in his sordid career, 35 women, with the help of the Florida justice system, brought him to justice, and the federal attorney of Florida, who was in charge of this, gave him a 2-year sentence, which he had to fulfill, I'm sorry, a 2-month sentence, which he had to fill in jail while being excused 6 days a week for 12 hours a day. The reason then an enterprising and important woman reporter in the Miami Herald brought up this case again, because the federal prosecutor in Florida in charge of this case, when asked, why did you let this guy go away with a slap of the wrist, said, oh, it was above my pay grade. In other words, the Secret Services intervened. He was then rewarded with a cabinet post on the Trump administration because both Trump and Bill Clinton flew on Epstein's private airplane, the Lolita Express, where they were allowed to rape these children on the plane. And when they landed at his 2 islands in the Virgin Islands, ironically, where they got a chance to rape these girls more. And this went on for many years, in part because he had the protection of the government. The flight logs that included Bill Clinton's name and Donald Trump's name have never been revealed. Finally, things were getting too hot for Weinstein because the deal was revealed and all sorts of questions were being asked. Epstein was put in jail in the federal metropolitan jail in New York, where he ostensibly committed suicide. They hushed up the reports, which were only there for 1 day, of people hearing screaming from his cell at the time he committed suicide. And of course, people don't usually scream when they commit suicide. Also, his injuries were not entirely consistent with suicide, his hanging injuries. And in addition, the light outside his cell happened to be broken. And his cellmate, even though it was mandated that that cellmate had to be there for 3 months, was moved. The 2 women who were supposed to check in on him after every half an hour were both fast asleep. They were both working over double shifts. And one of them wasn't even hired as a guard. She just happened to be working there from another department. And so, although his suicide was highly questionable, it passed. And as soon as this suicide happened, actually a little before, they broke into one of his mansions given to him by an enormously wealthy man. He ostensibly did stock transactions for very wealthy men and made an obscene amount of money from this. And he got his start with someone who was our federal attorney general's father at Dalton School, where Epstein was assigned a teacher position in physics and math, even though he hadn't even graduated from college. And Barr Elder was also a notorious sex offender. His name was Chester Barr. The kids called him Chester Molester. He fired or was quit and moved to another school. At any rate, you have this scam going on of girls being flown to a slave island where they're repeatedly raped and molested and drugged as well, and getting away with it because the tapes were given over to the CIA. When it looked like Epstein was in deep trouble and might be exposed, they blew up the safe. They forcibly entered his mansion, a $71 million mansion, and blew up the safe. And somehow all those tapes just disappeared. They were tapes of people like Jess Staley, head of Barclays Bank, Black, the head of Apollo Corporate Management, and perhaps our 2 presidents as well. In any case, the Epstein case is now forgotten by the media. Some of the scores of women molested and raped are trying to get some settlement from his estate. We'll see how that goes. And I think that's all that you don't know about, but it's a pattern. What all these serial molesters and often rapists have in common is that they're all very powerful men who give access to livelihoods for women. The way that Jeffrey Epstein got his young woman is he had procurer Ghislaine Maxwell, who's currently on trial, meet with these young girls and offer them massage jobs as a massage person for good money. And they were homeless girls usually, or very poor girls with no other access to income. And when they came into his mansion and were molested, they were silenced by the grandeur of his mansion and by the money all around them. And so that we have a pattern here, a pattern of patriarchy and capitalism shaping one another. Now, I ought to define my terms because those terms are bandied about without precise definition. Patriarchy is a system in which men, by virtue of being born to the male sex, have primacy over women. The Orthodox Jewish prayer in the morning for a man says, "Thank you, God, that I was not born a woman," included in his thanks to God, whereas women's prayers include, "Thank you, God, that I was born in your opprobrium," which means displeasure. That's an example. But every Orthodox religion has a special place for women's subordination, and patriarchy means that men, by virtue of maleness, have command over women. Women can be raped or demeaned, and it is their shame if that happens to them, and no particular consequence to the man. Women are defined to be the helpmeets for men, to serve them emotionally, to serve them sexually, to serve them doing housework and childcare and social connection for them and their relatives and their children. So, and that has been under attack by the feminist movement, of which I am a founder of the second wave of that. And the feminist movement's basic principle is that women are humans, are fully humans and capable of everything that anyone else, including men, are capable of and have to be treated as important human beings. Capitalism is an economic system based on profit. No one hires you unless they're making more money off of your work than they pay you. So if you work, let's say, in a chair factory, your work contributes more value to that chair than you're paid, or the capitalist in charge or the CEOs or board in charge would never hire you. The point is profit. The point is using a person's labor in order to profit and get more money for yourself. That can be mitigated quite a bit in terms of a powerful labor movement or a socialist government, neither of which we have in the United States, but that's what capitalism is about. And some of the revenue of capitalists is used to, let's say, have schools so that the workers you need can be literate if you need literate workers. And other services can be performed so that people can live and get to work and so on. But the main point of capitalism is profit. People say, why does Jeffrey Bezos endanger his Amazon workers by putting them too close together to pack the goods? Well, he's making more money, and that's the purpose of his life, more for him. So it is understandable. And capitalism and patriarchy combined in the abuse of these women. Cuomo had an office in which he hired mostly women, some men also, and bullied them in different ways in order to get his own primacy. And in the case of women, to use that primacy to get sexual services as well. He humiliated them, calling them honey and dearie, and insisting that they wear high heels and lovely dresses because they were sexual servants as well. They were there to please him. The way Fox News used to require that its female operators have glass desks and wear short skirts and high heels so that the men could look at their legs. This is a whole culture of patriarchal privilege enhanced by and increased by capitalism. So I hope you have an idea of that. And when I talk about gender, what I'm talking about is the meaning system applied to sexual differences, because there is no biological necessity of behavior in anything but reproduction in terms of male and female brains. The most exhaustive works on gender reveal that. So that we're talking about the cultural practices that go with and are assigned to male or female bodies. Okay, now, power, money, capitalist position, and fame all operated in these men's acquisition of female sexuality. Now, why would men be sex abusers? What is it about the male role that would allow that? And I should say that there are female capitalist sex abusers as well. They're far less numerous because there's only 3% of women in the United States who make $150,000 or more and are in much of a position to coerce men. However, where women have financial control over men's jobs, they often proposition and pressure them. The physical threat isn't there because women are less strong in our culture. But it isn't unknown for women to use their capitalist privilege to coerce men sexually as well. I don't think any of these things is inherent. I don't appreciate that power. I wouldn't want anyone to wield that power. I used to have a bumper sticker a long time ago when I had a car. I now live in New York City where it doesn't make sense unless you're super rich. But the bumper sticker said, women who want equality with men lack ambition. Because what I want is a better human world, not more money for myself. That's my ambition, to create a better world. At any rate, all of these things combine because in a capitalist system, other people are supposed to serve you. These powerful figures use their position to get services of every kind. Cuomo had people write his book, as well as be sexually available. Cosby had people adulating him because he was so famous and established and wealthy, and he got the people around him to cover it up. So that at the trials of these women, a 90-year-old man came forward and he said, I was the guard outside of Bill Cosby's door. I saw these very young women stagger out half clothed, but I knew my job depended on saying nothing. Cosby would say to me, I'm interviewing talent. Don't bother us under any circumstances. And he, knowing his place as an employee, was quiet until he was retired from his job. In the case of R. Kelly, with these very young women who were tortured and sexually used, he used his fame and his connections at his recording studio to silence his critics. Epstein used his connections with the CIA and his wealth to silence his critics and get off with a minor sentence. And I should say, in a cute little capitalist twist, after Epstein did receive his light sentence, he rehabilitated himself by being a philanthropist to science. And he got people writing articles about what a boon he was to science, much as the Sackler family, who caused 600,000 deaths in the United States since the 1990s when they introduced OxyContin and made 17 billion out of it. They established themselves as philanthropists, so nobody looked twice. They were philanthropists in science and in medicine, because these people can use their money in the capitalist press to give gifts to places like Harvard, they gave, or Brown University, or MIT, to make themselves look like philanthropists instead of look like terribly corrupt outlaws. Someone like Weinstein was the most powerful man in Hollywood. He could make or break a woman's career. And those people who wouldn't have sex with him, he broke. He sent messages to the studios and to the other producers that they were difficult to work with and killed their careers. So people like Daryl Hannah, who was a popular young, beautiful star, suddenly disappeared. No one would work with her. And he would do it because he would get women to work for him. He would get a woman to be his assistant, to lure these women into meetings with him about contracts to be in the movies. And then the woman who was present initially would disappear. And he was a large, heavy man, and he would coerce the young woman there and tell them that the only way they would get anywhere was to have sex with him. And he would tell the more established stars that if they didn't have sex with him, he would destroy their careers. And he did do that. So he used his capitalist position to enhance his patriarchal privilege. All of these men were eventually discovered, exposed, and punished. However, the pattern remains, and it's an important pattern and exists across all races, across all religions, across all jobs, and all ethnicities. And the reason it persists is because of several things, and I should talk a little bit about gender. One of the problems with being male is that men are not allowed the full range of their vulnerabilities and emotions. Little boys are taught that to cry is to be a sissy. Little boys are allowed anger, they're allowed to fight, but they're not allowed tenderness, they're not allowed solace, they're not allowed declared loneliness, they're not allowed need. And they can place all those vulnerable emotions into a compartment and act out on the emotions they're allowed, which are rage and coercion is not really an emotion, but rage and need for power. Women are the people who are the most powerful figures in every man's life. Every man, except for very, very few, and that's only beginning, every man grows up in a matriarchy of mothers, babysitters, daycare workers, nurses. And so the powerful figures that dominate their lives when they are most humiliated and helpless are women. And so a lot of men harbor a lot of hatred and anger at women and need to overpower them. Another factor is within our destructive gender divisions. Men don't have present fathers who can show them what being a man is. So often men, and particularly men in communities where fathers are rarely present, define their manhood as being rejecting anything feminine. And a lot of the best emotions are feminine: vulnerability, need, extension of yourself, emotional connection. And in their privation, they repress those emotions and therefore repress their compassion for the women that they dominate. And women are trained to take care. We play with dolls. In the United States, boys play with guns and rock'em sock'em robots and other aggressive things. The United States is particularly terrible about this. But we are trained to be caretakers. We are trained to be nice, to be pleasant, to be pleasing, and we're allowed a full range of emotions except aggression and expression of anger, which is rarely allowed in a woman. Women are considered bitchy and unpleasant if they're aggressive. At any rate, I've defined those things, and I think I've shown how they've worked in the cases of 5 men who have all been apprehended, unlike their millions out there who haven't. But that this is a case of patriarchy, male privilege economically and politically, though not emotionally, shaping dominating behavior, and women's need to please and be acquiescent, shaping their submission. I'd like to open this up to questions and protests or whatever you have.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Harriet, for sharing all of this. And I take liberty to address you by your first name because you have been so personal with us. And one of the things that it strikes me in listening to you is this comment, the linkage there is between wealth and power. And I think that what monetary reform people have in mind is that there are a lot of efforts out there to kind of control power that are blind to the role played by wealth in that power. And those two things are absolutely linked, wealth and power. And so we in monetary reform, I think, are interested in these mechanisms of excessive concentration of wealth. And what we see as one of the mechanisms, and it is not the only mechanism, but one of the mechanisms is the way money is created by banks, giving banks this central power of concentration of wealth. And it's banks that sit at this keystone within the economic system. And for that reason, I think monetary reform tends to focus on the creation of money by banks. And what we realize is that this is not the only way in our economic system that money wealth is concentrated. There are other issues. There are tax issues. There are monopoly issues. A number of things play a role. But our focus here is on this system of the way money is created as debt that has essentially caused this exponential rise in indebtedness. And where we have debt, we are likely to be subservient to those who have more power over us in ways that you have described. I wonder if you could comment on your thinking about the role of of wealth accumulation and the mechanisms that are involved, and with particular regard to the role of the banks in the process?
Well, wealth accumulation is built into the American Constitution. Those democratic lawmakers, I believe 9 of them had slaves, not very democratic to enslave people as property. Also, although we did have a wonderful thing in our Constitution, some checks and balances on power, there was no check on wealth and one person buying the votes of everyone else or of many other people. Banks are a tool of capitalism, and where they fail, the government comes in. And the US government in 2008 came in to hold them up rather than hold up the people whose failed mortgages, because banks were irresponsible in allocating them, failed and lost their homes. And I think what you have, where you have banks, is you have a system of privileging the privileged. One of the reasons Trump got so many loans from banks is because he could promise and lie about the value of the real estate he had, while he also lied about how much it cost in order to tax it. And banks were bailed out in the United States once they failed in 2008. And with the bailout money, bribed our lawmakers, who are often for sale, to extend their privileges and regain all the privileges they had that made them fail in the first place. Because where you have accumulated wealth and the power to deny or give people access to credit, you have enormous power. I just want to say one more thing. The banks did another very clever thing. What they did, instead of being taxed and having wealth taxed, they put out credit cards so they could make interest on people's indebtedness. Rather than give relief or push for higher salaries and better wages, they tax the people through credit cards, which are one of the biggest forms of debt in the United States. It's the second biggest after college debt, which the banks are profiting from immeasurably and using the money we gave them in the bailout to lobby against free college education for America, the way 7 European countries have it.
Yeah, thanks. Let's open this to some of the other folks who are listening. I think Howard Switzer is top on the list. So Howard, go ahead.
Hi, Harriet. So glad to that you could make it. I'm so happy to see you, and and hope the move all went good. It looks like you're all settled in and everything's copacetic. I had a question and wondered if you had a chance to look into the research on the psychological impacts of money, and that Kathleen Voss and some others had done. And the reason I ask that is because the money that we use, like you say, is credit. It's not, sovereign money. And the impacts that she had pointed out were things like non-cooperation, hyper-individualism. And these things are all happening, on the subconscious level. And I just wondered if you'd had a chance to take a look at that. And I hope you will in the future and let us know about what you think of that.
Right. Well, I think, of course, there's psychological ramifications. There are psychological ramifications to everything. And the basic idea of capitalism is more for me. What's good is more. So that it never stops. You can always accumulate more if you're in a position to. And that psychology has infected a lot of the United States, where people think only of themselves and not of a community. It's a very different thing if you have an economy built on cooperatives, where everybody makes the decisions and where they elect leaders who can who cannot be paid any more than the highest paid workers, and who have regular terms and can be removed, and where every worker has to participate. You can see the difference psychologically in Europe, where the labor movement is very powerful in France and Germany, because the highest paid union leader cannot be paid more than the highest paid worker in his union or her union. Makes a big difference. And so I think the psychology of a country in which the rich and famous are eulogized, praised, and adored just because they're rich and famous, no matter how they got their money, means that money is valued above all other human qualities. And and that means that it's harder to join unions, which empower people and give them the psychological sense that they're somebody. There's, an expression in English: if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? In other words, if you have a good mind, you've got to be making money, because what else do you do with your mind? Take care of other people, figure it out. And so everything is shaping everything else. And so the economic system and its laws affect everyone. And stark contrast, I also am an early childhood educator. The way you civilize children in the United States is you don't say, okay, Johnny, grab his tricycle and sell it back to him at the end of the day, right? No, you're supposed to share, because people aren't even civilized unless they consider each other's needs. But then when the child is about, let's say, 5 and they're in the playground, you see scenes like a kid just got a nice new shiny truck and he's putting sand in it from somebody's pail and shovel. And at the end of the play, he tries to be a nice kid and he says to his friend with a pail and shovel, I'll give you my truck and you give me your pail and shovel. And the parent says, are you kidding? I paid $14 for that truck, and gets up and grabs it. And so the child realized, wait a minute, those collective values that I learned in nursery school are contradicted here. And one learns that for the rest of one's life. So it becomes harder and harder to hold on to a sense of empathy and continuity with other human beings. And that psychologically is mitigated by joining with other people for the common good, whether it's joining a PTA, a parent-teacher association, or joining a union or a political party. And one of the things that happened to the United States is that when multinational corporations formed because jet transit was easy, because between faxes and computers, they could communicate so well with each other. So they outsourced good, well-paying union jobs, mainly male jobs, to places like China, Bangladesh, India, where people make a fraction of what they earned in the United States. And there's no ecological protections either. What a boondoggle. And then they came home and bought our legislators, many of them. Only in the last 10 years, there's a big resentment of that, and more people are socialists who are elected. That's why Cuomo couldn't get across some of the things he wanted, because socialists replaced the capitalists that he counted on. But there has been a terrible thing that happened. There's a book called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, based on studies that have been repeated over and over again by somebody called Robert Altemeyer in Canada. And he found that there are fewer people in any organization, whether it's PTAs, blood drives, political organizations, unions, than were in bowling leagues alone in 1970 in the United States. And that's particularly interesting because the mass outsourcing of American jobs happened in the 1970s. And people had to work many more jobs to gain anything like the income they had before. Women who did a lot of the volunteer work were forced into the labor force to make, because two wages don't make what one white male wage, I should say, earned in the early 1970s. And so people stopped participating. They became depressed. They sat in front of their TVs getting fat on crappy food. And it's only now that they're beginning to wake up that they've been robbed. So that there are all these changes that have happened. And they're changes that illustrate the way capitalism's movements and capitalism's values have psychological ramifications.
Yes, that for-profit mindset that you mentioned is one of the things that the Alliance is wanting to change and address by changing the first cause of money, which is right now issued for profit, for personal gain. And we think that a public money system would be issuing money for care, for the care of place and people. And so that's why we are pushing for a public money system. But thank you for all of that.
Now, let me turn next to Paul. I think I skipped over you, Paul. My apologies in the terms of the sequence. And Paul, you always have interesting questions, so go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm used to it. I was always the shortest guy in my first grade class, so I was always kind of skipped over. This is a real treat for me personally. I've been following Dr. Fraad ever since her first appearance on Economic Update that Professor Richard Wolff puts on, and following her ever since. And I have a question, and I don't want to hide a statement in the question, but I have to somehow maybe combine the two. As an activist and an advocate for monetary reform, I am finding myself extremely frustrated with my side of politics, the progressive left. There seems to be a vast crater in the understanding of the role of money, and that misunderstanding was not always part of our culture. In fact, monetary reform was the basis for the populist movement and the People's Party in the 1890s. They really got it back then, and somehow the left has lost that perspective. And I know, Dr. Fraad, you picked out several villains here, and I think your real point is that these villains are really just representative of the system.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, however, the left seems to, and I'm wondering, in terms of a psychological twist to this, if there's some kind of male need to identify an enemy, a victim, and put a face on them, and kind of lose sight of the fact that, not a victim, but villains, lose sight of the fact that there is an underlying system that these villains are just players in. And my question to you, I've approached Richard Wolff, Ralph Nader, personally, Chris Hedges, and I've asked them about the money system, and I always get the same answer. We need to break up the big banks, okay? And the problem is, our money system needs the banks. The banks were if the banks were not rescued under our current system, our whole economy would collapse because it's built upon the banks. Mm-hmm. And so it's really a systemic thing. It's not about, these evil bankers, and there are plenty of them, But can you give me some advice on how to get this message into the minds of people on the left so that it just becomes part of the narrative it's just not there. It's very, very frustrating. And I'm wondering again if there is some kind of psychological need to identify villains and enemies to fight against rather than something amorphous like a system.
Well, I think it is for a lot of people want to feel like there's a few bad apples in this bunch of rosy, ripe apples. They don't want to face that the system that they're living in is corrupted, and that one of the big corruptors is the banks, because they don't want to face, and particularly in the United States, in our dying empire, people don't want to face what has brought about the death of our empire. Afghanistan's a great example. People were making money, and our most lucrative area is the war machine, is making armaments. And so the people who invested in armaments have made 100% profit over the pandemic, because we've been killing people all over the world. And the banks are part of that capitalist system. All I can think of is that you're get articles on Portside, on Alternet, on the vehicles that convey these things, talk about it with the Democratic Socialists of America, appeal to Richard Wolff and Chris Hedges and Cornel West and other leading intellectuals in the United States, because there are many lacunae on the left. The left also leaves out psychology. It talks about the importance of organizing, but what is the personal transformation of being empowered by a group and a sense of belonging? It also doesn't talk about the family as an institution. Or just because people get pregnant doesn't mean they could take care of anybody. Children need help. There's lots of holes. And all you could do is try to fill them by talking to influential people and publishing whatever you can, however you can. And this coffee house is a way those ideas can be broadcast. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Mhm. Yeah, my last point is that the left seems to take money as a necessary evil, whereas money is necessary. It's the language that we use when we produce things to access what we as humans produce. And I don't know how to separate that, because money is vital. It's very important. And without banks in the current system, we wouldn't have money. And so even though banks do evil things, just getting rid of the evildoers is not sufficient.
No.
We have to change the system, because the system creates the imbalance and the inequality that we see. It's built into it.
It is.
And
Well, you can look at successes. You can look at the Paris Commune, which was an amazing thing. I don't know how they produced their currency, but that was very important. You could look at the beginning part of the Chinese Revolution and the beginning part of the Russian Revolution to see how they handled those things, because they did.
Mhm. Okay.
And people need unity. They need to make it simple. Trump was always saying this is a bad person, because he wanted to be the one deciding who was bad, because he was so terrible. It's part of it. But it's also because it dumbs down your audience. In the early and continuous speeches of Fidel Castro, he tried to educate his people. I remember him in his discussions of Palestinians and Israelis. He said, you don't find good guys here. There are problems on both sides. Let's look at how they interact. It was very important. Even though he came down on the side of the Palestinians, it wasn't because they were totally virtuous. And in this, this particular kind of wisdom is very important. So you don't look for the bad guy. And I just want to tell you a little story, which I find so indicative of the proper attitude. Bertolt Brecht, the famous communist poet and writer, probably the most famous poet and writer of the World War II era, after the Germans lost and Germany was split into East and West Germany, both East and West Germany offered him a theater where he could produce his plays, subsidized by the state. And he chose East Germany. And when they said, why did you choose East Germany? He said, well, if I have a certain amount of life serum and I am a physician, I have 2 patients, I have to decide to whom to give it, the syphilitic dying old man or the pregnant prostitute. I chose the pregnant prostitute. Now, the East Germans weren't all that flattered by such a characterization. But, you know, those were his beliefs. He didn't have to have a good guy and a bad guy. And we have to train people not to make things into some kind of God and the devil mentality, which dwarfs humanity. So I agree with you. I wish I could give you an answer. Yeah, do this, we'll all be okay.
Thanks, Harriet. Thanks, Paul, for the question. And I just want to tell you, Harriet, that of course, so far you've just been asked questions by us guys. But the fact is, the Alliance has depended on outstanding leadership from the women in the organization from its very beginning. And so the next 3 people who are going to ask you questions come from that group. And so we turn to Virginia.
I too am an early childhood educator, so I was pleased to hear that you have that connection. What I'm interested in is you've done an excellent job of expressing the importance of the system to people's behavior and attitudes. It's a vicious circle. How do we get off this wheel? And what would you recommend as a psychologist or psychiatrist that what messages do we promote that will shift the attitudes and awaken people to the alternative? What will be most effective?
Well, I think one of the biggest shifts is that the human race won't, oops, I'm sorry, I no longer see people every once in a while. One of the biggest shifts is recognizing our joint humanity and our need for each other. That we, especially as the planet is threatened, we need one another to survive. And emphasizing that over and over again, that no one needs no help. You know, in one of Brecht's poems, he says, "You, I beg you, show not wrath or scorn, for we need help from every creature born." And I think common need and common need for collective solutions is very important. And then to stress unionization. I mean, one of the things that Martin Luther King said is he said, one of the best solutions to racism is the union, because you need to come together. And he pointed to the Longshoremen's Union that used to not allow Black people, and then Black people became scabs and broke strikes, of course. But when they included Black people and gave them equality, they won their strikes. But you need to be united, and also to the left understand what our side has is the mass of people. What their side has is the mass of money. So we mass of people have to get together and work together and not let divisions, especially those arbitrary divisions that capitalism wants to highlight, like racial divisions, gender divisions, ethnic divisions, and sexual divisions, come between us. That humanity needs unity, I think, and then carry that out in every area.
Thank you.
I hope that makes sense.
Did we lose?
Oh, I was muted somehow. Yeah, Virginia, do you want to follow up with any kind of question, or should we go on?
No, I think I'm good. Those are good suggestions. I think that that's certainly one of the issues that we've had, even as a group, deciding whether we need to be sort of combative and set ourselves apart as a unique voice versus being more inclusive and stressing the importance of joining with others, even who maybe have a slightly different approach. So I'm pleased and happy to have you reinforce the idea that the more we get together, the happier we'll be.
Exactly. A lot of the left gets sidetracked into policing each other's microaggressions on race or gender or something else. Look, we should be considerate of one another, but the idea is what we have is each other. And I also want to say that there is proof, it's in a book called The Great Wurlitzer, that the FBI and CIA invested hundreds of thousands into the civil rights movement to make it Black power, race only, and the women's movement through Gloria Steinem, their key agent, to make ours a gender only movement and not a movement for liberation, including liberation of gender stereotypes. So it's also a very right-wing move to be so divisive.
Thank you. Debbie Hillman, your
Yes,
turn.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can.
I had to leave the meeting because it froze up, but I'm glad to be back. Dr. Fraad, I enjoyed your conversation with Sasha White about second wave feminism and what went wrong there, and about class consciousness. And I think somewhere in that interview, and also even today, what's resonating with me is something that I have been trying to formulate for myself. The Iroquois Confederacy was bicameral in the way that the U.S. is bicameral. There were men's councils and there were women's councils. They did different things, but they worked together. And the women actually set the agenda for the men's councils because they gave them the preferred options, the options that the women thought they could implement. So I have been studying the Iroquois Confederacy in detail, and as a 70-year-old lifelong feminist, without any income, so I am retired. I'm just trying to figure out how women in the United States can create some what I call women's public authority. Is that something like turning the House of Representatives into all women, or the Senate into all women, or some other version of it? I've been going into detail. So in the interest of just getting women to work together more across the United States, and then with other interest groups on other intersectional issues, do you have any thoughts about trying to formalize women's public authority in that way?
Well, I think we have to be very worried about dividing ourselves by gender. You know, women don't all have the same concerns. Someone like Hillary Clinton, who was a fake feminist in my eyes,
I agree,
wanted a $12.50 minimum wage, even though 66% of minimum wage workers are women, many of them single mothers. And Bernie Sanders, a man, wanted the $15 minimum wage. So I think we have to be careful not to polarize people by gender, or to assume that just because someone is female, she'll look out for other females. The Iroquois were a model for Susan B. Anthony in terms of gender equality, And when they had their meeting at Seneca Falls, they arranged their meeting with a big influence from the Iroquois. But of course, the Iroquois was a matrilinear society. Children were the children of the mother, and their primary male figure was the mother's brother, and the whole tribe looked after them. And if a woman wanted to divorce her guy, she'd just put his belongings out of the tent and he'd get the idea. It was a very different society, and the economy, you know, the economics were different. As long as the male wage dominates, women and children, and there's no state help, women and children tend to be dependent and therefore in a lesser position because your economic position has a lot of clout. So I think that we should work on joining mass organizations and looking and having a women's caucus that makes sure that our issues on which we can unite are joined with men, because I think it's divisive and destructive of the only possibility we have to win, to be too divided.
Well, thanks very much, Harriet, for that observation, because again, it's so easily for us to get almost unintentionally divided, and we have to resist that in every way. So thanks for pointing that out.
John, can I clarify though? The what I'm talking about is not going to one woman like Hillary Clinton and say, what do you think, because you're a woman. When I talk about women's public authority, I'm basically thinking the same thing as a women's caucus, where women come together and decide as a group together that what they bring to the larger electorate, or whatever the situation is. I'm very involved in food policy councils where 70 to 80% of the women of the people involved in the whole food justice movement are women. And so those are sort of de facto women's public authority. But it's so that's the kind of, I mean, I think we're agreeing, but I just want to make sure for everybody else who is listening that I'm not saying just go get one woman's opinion and take that as every woman's opinion. I absolutely agree with you on that.
I knew you did. I knew you did. And look,
okay,
people like the Gang of Four in the American Congress, of which the most vocal person is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you know, have a whole coterie of women, whether it's Ayanna Pressley or Ilhan Omar or Cori Bush, or there's Katie Porter in California, or Barbara Lee, that push humanitarian concerns and women's concerns and are looked to. But what's interesting in the US Congress is many of the progressive forces in the US Congress and also in the state government are women who are becoming powerful. And the most powerful unions in terms of their progressive view in the United States now are the Nurses Union, Nurses United, and also the flight attendants with Sarah Nelson. Because it was only Sarah Nelson who wanted a general strike when Trump wanted the airline workers to work for free, you know? So I think there's a natural possibility for women to join together for the values that are the best things about being a woman: empathy, kindness, connection, all of those.
Debbie, thanks very much for bringing that up. And I will say that I'm working with the local League of Women Voters in Athens, Ohio, and they have a committee to start looking at the monetary system. And hopefully will come out of that a movement within the League of Women Voters. And my experience in dealing with the League of Women Voters has been it's one of the most competent organizations I've ever been with, including the university that I was with. So I appreciate very much the potential here for women's input into this process, and seeking out myself through our local League of Women Voters.
Unfortunately, the League of Women Voters believes in the free market. You might want to check their website, especially under agriculture. So I'm just giving you a heads up there.
Yes, I know it. I know their documents very well. I'm very familiar with them, and it's true that they have their attitudes are certainly affected by the capitalist history in which we have all lived. But there's a commitment within that document you're looking at to taking care of human needs. And that's where the women's movement speaks out strongly. And so I think in the women's movement, we can get them to realize that in order to fulfill what they feel most deeply, they're going to have to change some other things about their thinking. So that's essentially what we're involved with our efforts. Let's go on to Lucille.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Dr. Fraad. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Say it again.
You are.
Oh, great. I had a question, and I still will raise it early on in your talk. I think both John Howell's and Paul's questions drove at mine. But before I make the question, or preface it by saying, it was curious to me, and it still is curious to me, but I'm very, very thankful, but curious why you chose to come spend a portion of your Saturday morning presenting to an organization that works on monetary critique and reform, called the Alliance for Just Money. And so I'm still curious about that. And the question, it drove off of, you said early on in your talk that capitalism is an economic system based on profit. And I forgot in my preface to say, I also appreciated in your presentation, and my colleagues in the Alliance don't really know this, but your attention to sexual violence and gendered and capitalist-based, patriarchy-based sexual violence is something I know firsthand about and have experienced directly and indirectly with, and it's very, very important. I have it that spans decades and spans continents. But those experiences also of spanning decades and continents is what has driven me to focus on the systemic, what I understand as the systemic force or source of capitalism, which is very old, is a good 700 years old or so, and predates really, gave rise to, I think, the capitalism of our modern era. And that's, so my question is, and I didn't want to put you on the spot, maybe it's not something you dug deeply into, or you have, and it's just not quite coming out. But, given that definition of that capitalism is an economic system based on profit, and later you said banks are a tool of capitalism, but then what is capitalism a tool of, one could ask. And I think it's a tool of those who cornered our money creation, which goes back, is a process that developed from the 13 to 14 1500s, was first systematized in the way we have it today in the late 1600s, and not in the United States for another couple hundred years of contested history. And so, that the question really that I had in the beginning, and I'll ask again. And I have sort of my own answer to it, but I'm really interested in how you answer it and understand it. Is what is the relationship, in your view, between our existing money system and capitalism or capitalist relations of production? What is the relationship? And yeah, I'll stop there, I think.
Well, I haven't specialized in the money system at all. But what I think is, look, in our capitalism, there are two basic classes of people. Just as in feudalism, there were the serfs and the lords. In capitalism, there are the employers and the employees. And banks are the tool of the employers in order to cement their position and expand it. And so that they are co-creators of this system. And under feudalism, usury, i.e. lending, was a sin in the Catholic Church, which dominated the Western world. But under capitalism, there's nothing, you don't go into business without it. And so I see them as co-creators. But I also think that there are a lot of different entry points to seeing what's wrong here. And they're all valid, and they all lead. Like, if anyone knows the comedian Richard Pryor, who mainly was about sex, but he really attacked capitalism. And if sex were his entry point, fine. If race is your entry point, fine. I think banks are a fine entry point because they are the Siamese twin of capitalism. One can't move without the other. And so it's enormously important. And I decided to talk to this group, partly because you asked me, that was nice, but also because I want all of us who see the looming disaster of the capitalist system to join together, so that even though monetary policy is not my focus, I see it as totally valid and would then want to talk about it with you.
Right. So if I could just make a follow-up and then I'll pass on. I think that, I see the systemic force or source of capitalism that drives it is really the private power to create money, and specifically to create what we, the people, and we, our government, use as money. The government defines the currency of the realm, but the means of payment denominated in that currency are created by banks when we agree to pay that amount plus interest to them. And they create it like this. And that power and the benefits, the decisions of where the money goes to, who does, like he said before, the access or lack thereof, they decide that. The amount they decide, and then they go look for the so-called reserve ratio. And the benefits, the seigniorage of that power to create and the first use, and their power is cost very little, and their first use is free for them, that belongs to the public.
Absolutely.
Not to the private. But people who just critique capitalism, profits will exist in the money system, in the economy that a just money system would lead, but they will be incidental. Profits will, the prices will revolve around the cost of producing goods and services. And, just like, and then supply and demand, if somebody can produce it less, the price, but you can't produce if you have a just wage and you're not externalizing costs on the environment, the prices have to reflect the real cost. And it will revolve around the price of producing goods and services within an economy where people have time to do things other than work, can create music and play, etc. Anyhow, without addressing the relationship, it's not monetary policy, it's the money system itself, how we create it, that needs to be addressed by people who critique and are against capitalism and patriarchy and the damage being done to our environment and killing off species. And that's what is being missed, and as Paul said earlier, was understood by a lot of people in the 1800s through the 1930s. And we didn't make the change that we should have. We did the temporary thing of putting up Glass-Steagall and creating FDIC, and Glass-Steagall came out, but those were in order to let the system survive. And the reform that we're working for, we've had semblances of it in our history before, and people in the 30s and the 1800s were working for it, and it didn't happen then. And the ball game is a little different because of the digital realm we live in now, but it's still an underlying systemic issue. And so I really appreciate your being here, and I'm going to be quiet. Other people want to talk and you may have a response, but we need you to help us to bring the underlying money system that does not end patriarchy, does not end racism, does not end environmental degradation, but is, I would argue, necessary in order to do any of those. So if we care about overcoming patriarchy and racism, sexism, environmental degradation, anthropocentrism, we're not going to do it without changing the money system at that level. And it's a people's movement, and then it's a damn legislative change. And the militarism, that's horrendous. And that we're going to allow drones
money.
going.
Militarism is part, because that's the most successful part of the American economy. I do think Glass-Steagall is a great example, because Glass-Steagall was passed and now Glass-Steagall has been repealed because they have had a lot of time to work on repealing it. They started, the capitalists who were taxed at 94% by FDR because they were threatened with extinction otherwise, worked as soon as he died and the war was over to reclaim their hold. And I think monetary reform and monetary transformation has to be part of a radical program. And I hope everyone in your organization gets out there and insists that it's be part of a left agenda. I totally agree.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lucille, and thanks, Harriet, for your response about that. I want to turn to Joe Polito.
Hi, fascinating discussion. I really like Harriet's emphasis on a unified front to better everybody's lives, and Virginia's follow-up on that. I really appreciate Lucille's comments. I have a much better appreciation because I read her essay on education, and she synthesizes so many things, including monetary reform, into her goal to improve education so that all children can flourish. The question I have is about capitalism. Traditionally, economics 101 is that we live in a mixed economy. Mariana Mazzucato, who's a wonderful economist, I think she's very good at linking the two together. Her best example is government, the moonshot. That was a government enterprise, and so many spin-offs for all of society in terms of so many things, including our computer world, and government research, which has been the basis for many tech companies to be so successful. I'm just a little confused about what you're saying, Harriet, and what other things I've heard people say about capitalism. It seems to me that the free market system does help us be very efficient and innovative. But at the same time, we want to make sure that it's for the benefit of everybody and it's not some avenue for the plutocrats, the hierarchical types who want to have everything. And monetary reform, to me, the way I see it is monetary reform is a big part of making capitalism work for us. Capitalism is not I don't see it as living in a capitalistic society. I see it as capitalism as being a part of our society, and our legislatures regulate it. And one of the regulations should be that the money system is controlled by the people, by their elected representatives, and that there's not a lot of economic rent skimmed off by the banking system, but rather Alliance for Just Money wants that money to be used for the benefit of the people and provide the necessities. And I mean, the Need Act says it all. So I guess my question is, Harriet, are you saying that capitalism has to go, or are you just talking about the tweaks, the essential tweaks that are necessary, the changes to make it work for us better?
I'm talking about the capitalism has to go, because a system based on profit of one person accumulating profit on the basis of others' labor instead of doing it collectively is immoral, it's theft, it's wrong. And I think socialism is far preferable. The socialisms are also more efficient and doing better. You look at the Scandinavian countries, which are amalgams, but they're basically socialism, where the government makes sure that capitalists cannot do whatever they want to enhance their profit. So if in Sweden, if you want to shut down your factory, you have to get every single person that worked there an equivalent job. So it doesn't pay. You might as well produce something else. And the socialist elements are what controls Germany, which is why their metal workers union, about 300,000 of them, just got a 22-hour work week, because they don't, and why every German company has to have on its board of directors the workers who work there, represented the ecological, people from the neighborhood who talk about the ecological impact, etc. Those are because Germany has an enormously powerful socialist party. Their next leader will probably be from the Socialist Party. But socialism mitigates capitalism, and they exist together. Even in China, the reason it's the most successful growth economy in the world, even though it has its own, authoritarian problems politically, it's the most efficient with the highest growth rate, because it doesn't allow capitalism to go uncontrolled. You need somebody to look out for the mass people's interest, and that's what socialism is about. So it doesn't totally wipe out capitalism, but it certainly mitigates its damaging social effects, and that's what I'm for. And the United States is way behind on all the social benefits and the ease of life that our European colleagues have. Portugal, since 2016, is a coalition of the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, and the Green Party. And there have been huge improvements in their quality of life. So I'm not saying no capitalist should be allowed to survive, but I think socialism is necessary to control capitalistic forces so they don't take over, as they have much too much in the United States. And monetary policy is part of that need to represent the mass of people.
Let's go on to the next question. I think next person in line is Steve. Is that Steve Norris?
Yes, that's me. Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to thanks Dr. Fraad for this powerful presentation. Definitely some tales of abuse and aggression in there. And you mentioned about the phrase policing microaggressions, I think. And I wanted to ask more about that because ignoring microaggressions can actually like be experienced as like oppression, and it can be a mechanism to keep the patriarchy going, and people might react to it by leaving. So I would wonder how we can be more aware of when microaggressions are happening and how to stop it from undermining solidarity.
Well, I think it's very important not to allow microaggressions, but not to condemn people and tell them that they are terrible because they said something that was insensitive to someone's gender. They used the word transsexual instead of transgender. They used the word Native Americans instead of Indigenous Americans, whatever. I think it's important to respond by saying that could be construed as insulting. So let's use this term because we're all in this together. We don't want to insult each other. However, I do know that in many left organizations, if somebody commits a microaggression, they make that person feel like a heinous criminal. The point is to include people, and if they're insensitive, to point it out in a way that is not insensitive, but admits their humanity as well as acknowledges that they've made a mistake. I remember when I was teaching at a university, I was talking about race and racism and slavery, and someone in the class said, if the slaves were so unhappy, why did they have sex with the masters? And why are there so many light brown Americans then? And people in the class said, oh, you stupid dummy, they were raped. And I said, no, any question needs to be respected or all people asking questions will feel unwelcome. And of course, that was a very naive question, but the way you treat a questioner or anyone who makes a mistake is as one of you who has made a mistake, but not as the enemy. And you don't want to mobilize that enmity because in my experience, which is long, left organizations dissolve much more because of the emotional environment than because of ideological differences.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that that is such an important issue that finds its way into so many organizations. We want to work together, but we're so worried about offending people and then how to respond to it when it happens. So I think this advice is really helpful. Ryan, I think you're next in terms of questions.
Ryan, where are you?
I don't think I had a question, did I?
Oh, I thought you were on the list that your name came up on the names that I was, but Ryan, you're probably thinking about a lot of this stuff, right?
Yes. This has been a very exciting conversation. I appreciate your perspective, Dr. Fraad. And I don't really have any pressing question other than just thank you for coming to this organization and chatting with us. I think this is a conversation that we don't often have in this space. So I really appreciate you stretching our minds in this way.
Thank you.
I'd like to make an observation here in terms of the discussion that we've had in terms of particularly around capitalism and socialism. And in my conversations with people, I've always tried to sort of damp down the dependence on these two terms because neither one of them are fully defined, and they generate typically more heat than light. And I think what our focus in the Monetary Alliance is that we want to go to the heart of the excess of capitalism. And the heart of the excess of capitalism starts with money creation, the process of money creation itself. So we're not saying the banks are evil. The banks are doing what they have been established to do by the Federal Reserve Act and by history. But the problem is they have taken over the creation of money. And with the creation of money is generated a lot of power. And where new money goes to right now to where people have money already and who can qualify. And what we need is, as Lucille pointed out and many others here, that what we need is to switch that creation of money from banks to the public sector. And as you probably know, that Dennis Kucinich introduced a piece of legislation back in 2011, 2012, that would do just that. And it was just a piece of legislation. It wouldn't require any constitutional amendment. It would simply require legislation that says, yes, we the people want to take over the money system so new money can go to things that serve our needs as a people. So that's sort of where we're coming from as an organization. So we hit what we think is the keystone of capitalism's excess, namely this process by which money is created. And we think that will have an enormous effect on a host of other things that give rise to some of the worst of capitalism. So that's sort of our orientation. And does that make sense to you?
It totally does. And I think you could look to Iceland and what the amazing way that they handled the recession, which is they had a vote of their people. They had a referendum. Do we want to have austerity here, or do we want to cut back on importing and look at who created this problem and take it in hand? They decided, okay, we'll eat more fish and we'll eat more of our local things. We won't import luxuries and we won't have austerity. And they took the worst offenders in the banking crisis in Iceland and put them in jail, and they nationalized the banks and so that they could run for the people. And it did them a lot of good. So, they're an example that people can do that. They can take over the banks in a democratic way, which they did.
Right. Yeah, they did. And that was an important step. And there are considerations elsewhere in other countries about taking over the monetary system. And I would like to make a further generalization here. It seems to me that wherever humans are, there are differences among us. Some people are interested in making money, some people aren't. So there will always be sort of wealth differences among and power differences among people. They tend to occur naturally. So it seems to me that the role of government, which is our collective regulation of ourselves, the primary responsibility is to temper this process of wealth and power accumulation. So regulations do that in the capitalist system, and in terms of financial regulations, they have been complete utter failures.
Because they're bought. If you can buy the legislators regulating you, okay, they're going to get the best democracy money can buy and its results.
Right. So the effort of going to the monetary reform is central to this process that I think we now recognize that one of the functions of government is to limit the excessive wealth maldistribution, because that occurs naturally. And so we collectively, through government, need to restrain that. And certainly the kind of socialist kind of arguments that you're making are part of that. And one part of that will be, I hope in this country is this attention to changing the monetary system so that we get public control of that money
Yes.
supply can be directed more effectively.
Totally.
Right. Right. So we're drawing to a close here in terms of 2 hours, and it's stressed all of our endurance. And I really appreciate your endurance through all of this. I have always admired you in terms of your ability to bring to questions sort of a clarity and a personal element that often the rest of us don't do. So I'd like to thank you so much. And I want to draw attention to the fact that we have another coffee house scheduled in October. It's October 25th. And Virginia Hammond will be leading that discussion. So with our thanks to Dr. Fraad and a thanks to all of you who have participated both verbally and on a very rich chat discussion, I think at this point I'll bring the session to a close. So thank you very much.
Very much. It was great to talk to you. Bye.
Bye now.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you. And everyone can unmute.
Thank you.
Say your hellos and goodbyes. Thank you, Dr. Fraad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very well.
Thank
you.
Thank you, Harriet.
Sure.
Thank you very much. See you on the Feldman Show.
Yes, you will. Mondays at 8. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John, especially.
Okay, Ryan, I think you can pull it to a close.
All right. Adios, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.